Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 220. This time I'm going to talk about Miles Davis's record Bag's Groove from 1957, released on Prestige. This is not from 1957, as you can tell from the barcode. This is a 2019 mono reissue from Original Jazz Classics, which sounds pretty good to my ears. This record is a tale of two sides and, to a degree, two eras of Miles Davis. And funnily enough, these eras are presented in reverse order. Side 2 is recorded in the spring of 1954. It features Sonny Rollins in particular and is one of the very last vestiges of Miles's bebop work, although it's again vestiges because it's not purely bebop. Side 1, which is really the highlight, is recorded 6 months later, and this is after Miles had become obsessed with the more spacious feel. He was trying to move beyond bebop, and he became obsessed with the sound that Ahmad Jamal, the pianist, was getting, which was much more minimalist and much airier and much more indicative of where Miles was going to go in the future. That side features two takes of the same track, with a lot of egos jousting for space. Monk is on here as well. But in general, a very open feeling, and this is really one of the first great post-bebop records. I talked a lot about Miles's early history when I talked about his record Birth of the Cool, from his St. Louis origins through his time with Billy Eckstine and Charlie Parker, to his work with Gil Evans and Jerry Mulligan, and the development of the Miles Davis Nonettes, who, of course, were the group that recorded in 1949 and 1950, all those sessions which were eventually compiled as Birth of the Cool. In the midst of all this, Miles travels to Paris in 1949, and he observes, as was pretty obvious to any black person who traveled from the United States to France in 1949, that black people were treated with more respect in French society than they were in American society. And this is an observation which clearly hardens Miles's outlook on what was basically America's informal apartheid at the time. He comes back to the States. He'd been involved in a lot of really groundbreaking and exciting musical developments in the later 40s. But 1950 is a bit of a down year for Miles. He had a great reputation, but he didn't actually have a ton of recorded output to his name. He wasn't getting much work. He was also addicted to heroin, and that habit was getting expensive. That year he was touring with Billy Eckstine and Billie Holiday. Out in LA, he gets busted, eventually beats the charges, but again, not a good time. His luck changes, however, in 1951. Bob Weinstock, who had just started Prestige Records a year or two before, by that point had heard the music of the Nonette, the Birth of the Cool sessions, and was impressed and signed Miles to a one-year deal in January of that year. Despite the deal and the upturn in his fortunes, Miles's heroin habit is really starting to get the better of him. He was pimping to get cash, and he was also borrowing money from friends. Things were kind of spiraling downhill. There was not a lot happening musically. And in 1953, he takes a break, goes back to St. Louis, lives with his dad for a while to clean up. Then he goes to Detroit, where, as he saw it, it would be much less easy for him to get heroin than it was in New York. Eventually comes back to New York in the spring of 1954 and takes up boxing, amongst other things, as a means of staying clean and staying fit. Overnight, he's back from his year in the wilderness, and he's back with a bang. He got immediately back into the studio for Blue Note in March that year, making Miles Davis Volume 3, and for Prestige, making the Miles Davis Quartet. For both records, he uses a lineup of Horace Silver on piano, Percy Heath on bass, and Art Blakey on drums. On the second of those records, he also brings in John Lewis, Charles Mingus, and Max Roach. He kept very busy that spring as he felt strong and in control of his playing after beating his habit. He makes two other records that April with Silver and Heath plus Kenny Clark on drums and some rotating horn players, and these end up getting released by Prestige as the Miles Davis All-Star Sextet and the Miles Davis Quintet. In June, he takes Silver, Heath, and Clark into the studio with Sonny Rollins and makes Miles Davis with Sonny Rollins, which is largely seen as Rollins' big break, launching him into the big time. However, with that frantic period of recording between March and June over with, in the latter part of 1954, Miles avoids the studio and starts to focus on his own technique and expanding his sound and evolving his sound. He was no longer, and had not been for some time, interested in the busy, frenetic sound of bebop. He wanted a more spacious feel, and as I mentioned, he'd become a fan of Ahmad Jamal, that very minimalist player certainly was at the time, who was exploring a minimal sound in a very minimal environment, which was a piano, bass, and drums trio. Absorbing all this and thinking it through, Miles eventually does return to the studio on Christmas Eve, 1954. The The producer of these recordings is Bob Weinstock, but this record as a whole, as I mentioned, is kind of cobbled together. It contains 2 takes of the title track, Bag's Groove, from the Christmas Eve session. This record comes out in 1957, but in 1955, shortly after these sessions, one of those 2 takes has already been released on Miles Davis All-Stars Volume 1. The rest of this record, side 2, all comes from that June 1954 session with Sonny Rollins, and some of those songs had already been released on the record Miles Davis with Sonny Rollins. But as much as those are great tracks, all the drama really revolves around the Christmas Eve session. Weinstock calls up Miles in December and finds out that Miles is ready to come back into the studio and says, look, I can line up Percy Heath, I can line up Kenny Clark, and we can get Milt Jackson in on vibes. And Miles says, okay, this is great. Miles then says to Weinstock he wants to bring in one of his preferred piano players, either John Lewis or Horace Silver. Weinstock says, well, actually, neither of those. I actually want Monk. He's one of our stars. He's under contract to us. We're going to get Monk. Miles was not impressed. He liked Monk, but he felt their styles were totally incompatible, and he says in no uncertain terms to Weinstock, I can't play with that motherfucker. And Weinstock says, it's Monk or no date. Long pause. Miles goes, okay. However, though he agreed to have Monk in the session, Miles had something to say in this session, and he wanted to get it right, and he felt that Monk's quirkiness was going to completely throw him off. So he asked Monk not to comp underneath him when he was playing his solo, which apparently, unsurprisingly, didn't sit well with Monk. Milt Jackson, the vibist from the Modern Jazz Quintet, is also in the session, obviously. Bags, of course, is his nickname. Bags Groove is his composition. It's a standard from his own group. And so to recall the lineup on side 1, which is the Christmas Eve session from 1954, is Miles on trumpet, Milt Jackson on vibes, Percy Heath on bass, Kenny Clark on drums, and Monk on piano. On side 2, which was recorded 6 months earlier on June 29th, it's Davis, Heath, and Clark, joined by Horace Silver on piano and Sonny Rollins on tenor sax. Side 1 starts with take 1 of Bag's Groove by Milt Jackson, one of the most memorable melodies in all of jazz and arguably the definitive treatment of this tune in track 1. The first solo by Miles is elegant, it's intellectual, it's studied, it's everything one expects of him, particularly at this particular phase. Then Jackson comes in on vibes, much bluesier, actually, I think, than Miles is playing, perhaps because Monk, who was silent during Miles' solo, is now comping underneath him. But the highlight here is Monk's solo, which is the most Monk of Monk solos you could have. It's pushing at every assumption of how to play jazz piano, of how to do the timing, how you're supposed to form chords. It's just magic. And the contrast between these 3 solos, between Miles's pristine, austere lines, between Jackson's very bluesy solo and vibes, and Monk's treatise on the virtues of being different, awesome. The second take on its own is a great recording, but it isn't quite at the same standard as the first take. Monk's solo is a departure from his earlier effort, which of course was a highlight of that first take. In that earlier effort, he was picking out his notes very carefully. Here he's almost hammering the notes. Again, you could play these back and forth and compare them for days, but I very much prefer the first take. Side 2, and we're now back 6 months with the Sonny Rollins sessions, starts with Aragon, which is a Sonny Rollins composition, Nigeria spelled backwards. It's the very first recording of a Rollins composition, and it's a great one. Miles takes the first solo, and then Rollins comes in with a tone which I find very raw and very satisfying, and helped out by the fact that Heath and Clark are tight as a drum as a rhythm section underneath. Olio, also by Rollins, is a kind of unusual track which marks him out for the first time, but this will be continued, as a composer of real wit. Gershwin's But Not For Me is next. This has kind of a walking rhythm. Miles' solo is really upbeat and airy, despite the basically melancholy nature of the tune. Both Rollins and Silver kind of maintain the same mood. Doxy is next, another Rollins composition about a woman, but nobody can remember quite whom at this point. The record finishes with another take of But Not For Me. This is significantly faster, but I actually prefer the second take, which had occurred earlier in the side. There's not much to dislike about this record. The talent here is wall to wall. It's Sonny Rollins, well, effectively his debut at this high level. There's also on side 1 the frisson of this clash of egos going on just below the surface. This is one of the great modern jazz records, and it's also a great little time capsule of the transition between bebop and hard bop. It's an essential part of any jazz collection, and it's 5 out of 5 stars.